So if this dress looks maybe a little bit familiar, but maybe a little bit more blue, then it's probably because you've already seen it in my last video. So in my last video, I sewed a Zimmermann style linen mini dress with lots of buttons down the front. And I had a lot of requests through Facebook and YouTube and Instagram to digitize the pattern and have it available online. I did mention it in the video, but that's actually what I've been working on over the last month or so. So I've decided to learn how to digitize patterns, learn how to grade patterns, that's a lot of work. And that would be in the hope that I could make this available online for everyone to have access to, and that's exactly what I did. So I'm really excited and very proud to say that I've released my first digital pattern. Hopefully it's the first of many, and essentially the digital pattern will give you full instructions, all the pattern pieces, and of course this full sew along tutorial so that you can exactly replicate this Zimmermann style mini linen dress with the beautiful bishop sleeves, the beautiful buttons all down the front, so that we can all have matching dresses. Anyway, when I first started sewing and when I first started drafting patterns, I thought, oh, it would be so cool to have, a digital pattern available online, but I just didn't really understand how to get there, and I didn't really want to learn a new skill at the time. I thought it would be too hard, and it is hard. It's a lot of work. So I'm really happy that I did put in the time and the effort to learn this, because hopefully someone else, benefits from it. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about the dress. So the digital pattern that I have created is available on Etsy. I will have a link in the description box below. I've made it very affordable. I don't think that digital patterns should be particularly expensive. And within the digital downloads, you'll obviously have all of the pattern pieces that I've used to create this dress in various sizes. And those digital pattern pieces are available to be able to print from home, or you can print them in larger size documents at professional printer. I've got instructions on how to do both. I just print mine at home. It also has a complete digital PDF sewing instruction guide. So from step 1 to the final step, you've got everything laid out in front of you with full instructions and photos. But this video right now is also going to be a full tutorial on how to follow each of these steps. Anyway, I'll wrap this intro up so that you can get straight into the tutorial, but I will mention before I go that not everyone likes to download a digital pattern. And if that's the case and you want to make this dress but you don't want to download the digital pattern, then my video prior to this, so the one where I've sewed this dress, the exact same but in pink, actually shows my process of drafting the pattern. So if you would like to have a go at drafting it yourself, I have given full instructions there. You will need a bodice block at least, and maybe a sleeve block. But I think that even with, probably minimal drafting experience, you can probably make the exact same pattern. So the digital pattern is certainly available for those who prefer that, but if you prefer to draft, then definitely follow the prior video, because that will give some good instructions on how to do that. But I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I hope you enjoy the digital pattern. I'm so proud of it, so enjoy. Let's start by printing our pattern pieces. If you're printing from home with an A4 printer, it's very important to note that your printer needs to be set at 100% scale. This will ensure that there is no discrepancy between the measurements once your pattern has been printed. On your printed pattern pieces, you'll notice that there are test squares which you can use to ensure that your printer has printed the documents out at 100% scale. It's also very important to note that most home printers will cut off a 5mm border around each piece of paper. This will not affect your pattern at all, but you do need to ensure that when you tape your pattern pieces together, the pages are taped side by side. You don't want to overlap any of your paper pieces when taping them together. When cutting out pattern pieces that have multiple sizes, you'll notice that there are different styles of dotted or dashed lines. They indicate the cutting lines for different sizes. So prior to cutting, you need to ensure that you've taken your measurements and you have picked your correct size so that you're cutting the correct pattern pieces. The sewing instructions that are included with your digital pattern download include a complete guide of how to take your own measurements to ensure that you are selecting a pattern size that fits you best. Once we've cut out our paper pattern pieces, we need to cut out our fabric. I do have a guide in your digital sewing instructions that would come with the pattern that show the best way to place the pattern pieces on your fabric, depending on the width of the fabric that you've purchased. It's very important to ensure that you transfer all notches and markings from your paper pattern pieces over to your fabric. We will fuse interfacing to pieces 12 through to 16, which will be the collar pieces and the skirt facing pieces. Pieces 1 and 6, which is our center front bodice and our center front skirt pieces, will also have a 1 centimeter wide strip of interfacing fused to the center front of each of those pieces. This will align with where your button loop symbols will show on your digital pattern pieces. We'll then sew the center front bodice to the side front bodice with right sides facing, matching the notches along the bust line. You can finish the seam with bias binding or with a serger and repeat for the opposite side. You'll notice that a lot of seams in this garment are actually French seams, but I won't suggest to do that within the pattern if the seams are slightly curved, as they are very difficult to sew with a French seam. Sew the center back bodice to the side back bodice with the right sides facing, matching the notches. You can again finish the seam with an overlocker or bias binding and repeat for the opposite side. We're then going to sew the side front bodice piece to the side back bodice piece at the side seam, indicated by black triangles, with a French seam. To achieve my lazy girl French seams, I suggest to stitch your fabric together with wrong sides facing at a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. You're then going to press the fabric open, fold the fabric with the right sides facing and press along the seam line, and then stitch along that new folded seam line with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. You'll then need to press this seam open again, pushing all of your French seam to the back side of your garment. This will achieve a very lazy, no trim French seam. Sew the shoulder seams of the front and back bodice pieces with a French seam and repeat for the opposite side. It's really good to stay stitch the neckline and the arm's eye for each side of the bodice pieces to reduce the fabric from warping, and repeat this for the opposite side of the bodice. We're now going to move on to our sleeves, where we will sew the side seams of each sleeve piece together using a French seam. This will essentially give you a cylinder for the sleeve. Sew a basting stitch along the hem of the sleeve where your wrist would be, with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance from the raw edge. We're then going to use this basting stitch as a guide to fold and press the hem of the sleeve into the inside of the sleeve. We'll then fold a second time, again towards the inside of the sleeve, but this time at a 1 centimeter distance. We'll then stitch this folded hem down with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, which will ensure that you're catching just the edge of that folded hem, but you do need to ensure that you leave a 5 centimeter gap within this hem. This will create a channel for us to insert elastic. To ensure that the size of your elastic around the wrist is comfortable, measure the size of your wrist and add 2 centimeters. Cut 2 pieces of elastic at this length and attach a safety pin to one end of the elastic. We can use this safety pin to thread the elastic through the channel that we've created in the sleeve hem. Once complete, you can stitch the 2 ends of the elastic together to secure them and stitch the gap in the channel closed with the elastic inside. Repeat for the opposite sleeve. We're then going to sew a basting stitch between the front and back notches on the sleeve cap, and this will be used to gather the excess fabric at the sleeve cap into the arm's eye. Use your longest stitch length as it will make it a lot easier to gather. It's optional to add piping or trim to the arm's eye seam where it meets the sleeve. If you like to do this, it's wise to baste this in place along the arm's eye, facing the right side of your fabric prior to pinning and stitching the sleeve in place. We're then going to place the sleeve cap into the arm's eye of the bodice with the right sides of the fabric facing. First, you'll align the side seam of the bodice with the sleeve seam and pin. We're then going to pin the center of the sleeve cap to the shoulder seam on the bodice, And then we're going to use the basting stitch that we've just sewn around the sleeve cap to gather down the excess fabric until it matches the size of the arm's eye. Before stitching this down, it's optional to insert a little piece of tulle into the shoulder seam. This will help you to achieve a little bit more of a puffy appearance to your shoulder. To do so, fold your piece of tulle in an accordion style pleat. You can stitch this down to secure. The piece of tulle should then be placed at the center of your sleeve cap with the unstitched edge of the tulle pointing towards the length of the sleeve. Stitch around the arm's eye to secure the sleeve and bodice, and finish this seam with bias tape. Press all of the seams in towards the sleeve and repeat for the opposite sleeve. We're now going to move on to our skirt panels, which will be stitched together with icons matching. So you will match the star to the star, the circle to the circle, or the square to the square. This will help you to properly align each of the skirt panels, which you will stitch together using a French seam. And you will end up with the center front skirt panel attached to the side front skirt panel, which is then attached to the side back skirt panel, which is then attached to the center back skirt panel. You'll repeat this for the opposite side. You will notice throughout this tutorial that some seams are finished as a French seam. This is optional. If you decide not to use French seams, then replace all French seams with a regular seam stitched with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. We're going to attach the bodice to the skirt panels with the right sides of the fabric facing. The princess seams on the bodice should align with the seams of each panel on the skirt. And we're going to stitch this with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and finish with bias tape. Repeat for the opposite side. It's very important to hang these two sides of the dress up for at least 24 hours, as a lot of the skirt pieces have been cut on the bias and they will stretch dramatically. You can see how much one of the seams that I've cut on the bias has stretched just from handling it. Although your skirt facing pieces will be perfectly aligned on paper, fabric has a tendency to stretch when cut on the bias. And then it's wise to even out these hems by measuring along the hemline and cutting any excess fabric. We're going to prepare the modesty panel by folding the pieces lengthwise, wrong sides facing, and stitch the two shorter sides closed. You can then open this piece so the wrong sides face and press neatly. The long edge of the panel parallel to the folded edge will stay unstitched and open. We will then pin bias tape to the center front edge of one side of the dress, enclosing the raw edge of the center front seam. Before stitching, we're going to insert the modesty panel in alignment with the placement notch located approximately 5 centimeters above the waist seam. The panel should be placed so that the open edge is sandwiched between the center front of the dress and the bias tape, effectively hiding it. Stitch along the bias tape with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, ensuring the front and back of the tape are both secured within the stitch. We're then going to fold the bias tape in towards the wrong side of the center front of the dress and top stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance on the folded edge. This will secure your bias tape to the inside of the dress and allow your modesty panel to flip out. Prepare the button loop pieces by folding the long raw edges in towards the center of the strip. We'll fold in half again to conceal the raw edges and stitch this down. This will result in long strips of fabric measuring 1/2 centimeter wide. We're then going to cut this into small pieces indicated by the dotted lines on the pattern piece. You'll need roughly 36 unless you decide to include more or less buttons on your garment. It's completely up to you. Now, if you would like to add piping or trim to the center front of the dress so that you can see it just behind the button loops like I have, then the easiest way is to stitch it directly to the bias tape before we move on to the next steps. We're going to repeat the same steps that we did when we attached the bias tape to the opposite side of the dress. However, this time we will not install a modesty panel on the opposite side, but we will pin the button loops at the indicated positions along the center front bodice and skirt pieces. They should be pinned 5 millimeters inside the edge of the bias tape, and they will be sandwiched between the right side of the fabric and the tape. Something to note is it's very difficult to place button loop indication points correctly on the pattern for every size, so you may wish to alter the placement to suit the size of your garment. I prefer that my button loops are 2 centimeters apart, and I have 16 on the bodice and 20 on the skirt. Again, you can add more or less button loops at your discretion. Again, just like we did on the other side, we're going to press and fold this bias tape under towards the wrong side of the fabric and top stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. This will catch the bias tape on the wrong side and flip your button loops out perfectly. We're then going to move on to the collar. We'll pin 2 collar pieces with the right sides facing and stitch along the upper and curved edge until we hit the notch indicated on your pattern piece. Again, piping or trim is optional, but if you wish to add this to the neckline, it's best to base stitch your trim to the neckline of your bodice and base stitch your trim to the top and curved edge of your collar pieces. Split the seam allowance down to 5 millimeters and fold it so that the right sides are out and press it neatly. Along one of the open edges, we're going to fold and press the raw edge 1 centimeter in towards the inside of the collar. This will be the back side of the collar. Trace this folded edge onto the wrong side of the front side of the collar. This will give us an indication of where we need to stitch to ensure that we can catch the back side of the collar when we use our stitch in the ditch method later on. We're then going to align the front side of the collar with the neckline of the dress, right sides facing, and stitch with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. But ensure you're stitching 1 to 2 millimeters above the line drawn in the previous step. Press your seam allowance up into the collar and repeat on the opposite side, ensuring that you reverse the sides that you have indicated for the front and the back of the collar to match the opposite side of the dress. The back sides of the collar will stay completely unstitched for now, as we'll need to stitch them down after the zipper has been installed. To install the invisible zipper, pin the zipper tape face down to one side of the center back seam, facing the right side of the fabric. The top of the zip should be aligned with the top edge of the collar. We're then going to fold the back side of the collar inside out so that it is over the zip. This will completely encapsulate the zip within the collar piece. I'm then using an invisible zipper foot to stitch down the length of the zipper as close as I can to the zipper teeth. And once I get to the end of the zipper, I'm going to backstitch a few times. Repeat on the opposite side. To close the remaining portion of the center back seam where the skirt pieces will meet, move the zipper tape towards the raw seam and stitch a straight line from where you stopped at the end of the zipper tape to the end of the skirt pieces. We can then snip the raw edge just under where the zipper tape ends and fold the center back seam raw edges in on itself and top stitch to secure. This is the easiest way to neatly finish off that seam. The raw seam under the zipper tape can be finished with bias tape. We can now finish the back of the collar, which will be secured to the neckline using the stitch in the ditch method. We'll fold the back of the collar towards the back of the garment and pin in place. And you'll notice that from the front of the collar, stitching along the existing seam or ditch between the front collar piece and the neckline of the bodice will catch the back of the collar piece. This will allow you to secure everything neatly without an extra visual seam line. We're then going to prepare our skirt facing panels in the same way that our skirt pieces were stitched, with icons matching, so matching the star to the star, the circle to the circle, or the square to the square. Using French seams, we will end up with our center front facing panel connected to the side front facing panel, which is connected to the side back facing panel, which is then connected to the center back facing panel. We're going to repeat for the opposite side, but this time we are going to connect our two center back facing panels with a French seam. Again, if you would like to add piping or trim to the hem, it is best to do so now by stitching this to the front side of our longest or bottom edge of our combined hem pieces. On the upper or top edge of our combined hem pieces, we're going to stitch 1 centimeter away from the raw edge and use this to press and fold the fabric on this line of stitching in towards the wrong side of the facing. This is to prep the facing pieces for their final installation. We're then going to attach horsehair braid to the skirt hem on the right side of the fabric by stitching it to the raw edge with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. We're then going to fold the horsehair braid out towards the hemline and press. We can then align the bottom edge of the facing pieces with the folded edge of the hem, right sides facing. The horsehair braid will be folded out of the way. We're going to stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance from the raw folded edge of the hem. This will attach your facing to your hemline with the horsehair braid in between. Fold and press the horsehair braid and the facing up into the wrong side of the dress. The facing will then cover the horsehair braid. You can now blind stitch or slip stitch the facing to the inside of the dress by hand or by machine. I prefer by hand. If you decide to create a matching belt, then I suggest that you cut buckram to the desired length and width of your belt. You can choose whatever length you like, but it's smart to have your waist measurement plus an additional 20 to 40 centimeters, depending on how far around you would like the belt to wrap. The belt width should be 0.5 centimeter to 1 centimeter less in width in comparison to the width of your belt buckle. Cut 2 strips of fabric, which are the width and length of the buckram that you have just cut, plus a 1 centimeter seam allowance around all edges. Fold, press and pin the first piece around the buckram. Repeat with the second piece, however this piece will be folded so that it sits neatly with the raw edges folded in on itself instead of around the buckram. Top stitch around the entire length, catching both pieces of fabric with the buckram in between. You can see that I've popped some piping in between these two pieces so that it is sandwiched between the stitches as I top stitch around.
Sew a small circle stitch either by hand or by machine approximately 5 centimeters from one end of your belt and pierce through the center. This is where your belt buckle will be inserted. We can then fold the extra fabric back to the wrong side of the belt and secure either by machine or by hand. To measure your desired belt hole locations, it's best that you just put the belt on. I like to add 2 to 3 belt holes on either side with around 2 centimeters between each eyelet. I've used instructions from a birch eyelet kit to install the eyelets. However, you can opt to use the same circle stitch from the previous step to create belt holes if you don't have a similar kit. To prepare your belt loops, they will be folded in the same way as we did with the button loops, with both raw edges folded and pressed inwards and folded in half again. We'll then stitch down the open folded edge. Fold each edge of the belt loop in by 1 centimeter and align on the side seams of the bodice in your desired location. Top stitch these to secure them. It's important to note that if you have a wider or thinner belt, you may want to amend the length of your belt loops to match. Our final step is to hand stitch the shank buttons. Pin the center front of each side of the dress together, ensuring you align the pieces at the waist seam. Mark the button locations according to your button loop placement with a heat removable pen and hand sew each shank button down. I prefer embroidery thread as it's much stronger.
So this brings us to the end of our tutorial, and hopefully if you've been following along next to your sewing machine, then you too also have a beautiful copy of this dress of your own. I'm really happy with my second version of the dress. I have to say I'm not quite sure which colorway I prefer. You know, the pink with the gold buttons is very striking, but then I also think I'm a bit of a blue gal, so maybe you can let me know in the comments below which color you prefer. I think I'm actually going to wear the blue one tonight. It's my anniversary dinner, so, you know, I always try and wear something a little bit more special, something that I've made myself. So I think I'm going to wear the blue one tonight because it hasn't been out of the house yet. But please let me know which color you prefer, pink or blue. It's always hard remaking the same dress twice because obviously, you know, this was the last project that I worked on, but in the pink colorway. But I think when you really, really love, you know, a design so much, then it's okay to make it 2 times in a row back to back. As I've mentioned throughout the instructions in the dress, there's a lot of optional features. So, you know, you can decide to keep or remove the piping or trim elements. You can add or subtract button loops and buttons from the front of the dress. You can probably increase the hemline if you prefer. So I'm sure that there's going to be a few little variations if any of you have followed along and made the dress yourself. But like I said at the start of the video, if you have downloaded my digital pattern, thank you so much. And if you have decided to make the dress, then please send me some photos. I would love to see them. It's so exciting to me again because it's my first pattern. But I really hope that you enjoyed the tutorial and that the instructions were really nice and detailed. I tried to make it, you know, as up close and personal and detailed as possible. And I do appreciate that there's some elements of the dress that are just a little bit difficult. You know, invisible zips are always a little bit tricky, and there's always going to be bits and pieces on every pattern that are a little bit more hands-on, a little bit more difficult. But I hope that having the written instructions and this tutorial video really helped to guide you along the process. And again, I just want to say a really big thank you to anyone who does decide to, you know, have a look and have a go at my digital pattern. And also thank you for all of the support on hopefully this video and definitely on my last video as well. So really looking forward to making some more digital patterns and sharing my creations with you.